Joining us now is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He's the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, and he's also the former Associate Editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Roberts, what is the greatest danger facing the world today? Is it in the financial arena, the war arena?
The greatest danger facing the world is the aggression toward Russia from Washington, which gets imposed on NATO. This is extremely dangerous. You really don't just go out and manufacture a threat out of thin air without setting in motion a momentum that leads to war. Well, ever since the Russians put their foot down about the planned American invasion of Syria and planned bombing of Iran, Washington decided to make an enemy out of Russia because Russia wouldn't simply go along with whatever Washington wanted to do. And so we've had all these fantastic lies. I mean, they're major. They're the most extreme lies that makes Hitler look truthful. Washington lies so badly. So then the lies have followed up with organizing a NATO naval presence in Russian Black Sea. There's absolutely no reason for this except to be provocative. They're organizing another naval presence in the Baltic Sea. Again, the only reason for this is to be provocative. We keep announcing more troops, more tanks into the Baltic countries, into Poland. We persist in this effort to build anti-ballistic missile bases on Russia's borders. And we continue to listen to the Joint Chiefs of Staff describe Russia as an existential threat to the United States. This is all reckless provocation. And the Russians have to take it seriously because they have to say, well, there's no basis for any of this, so they must intend to attack us. Why else would they be doing it? And then Washington is trying to pull the same stunt with China, telling China where it can have bases, who has jurisdiction over islands in the South China Sea, and so on and so on, and claiming not to recognize Chinese boundaries and conspiring to build more naval and air bases to surround China in order to control shipping and resource flows in and out of China. And this is also provocative because China's not doing anything. They're not threatening us. Russia's made no threat whatsoever to the U.S. or NATO or the Baltics or Poland. And so you have to say, since all three of these countries have nuclear capability of a high order, that we see Washington driving the world toward a nuclear war, which simply will mean the termination of life on Earth. And that has to be regarded as the greatest threat. Now we can say, well, will things change when Obama leaves? No, they won't change. The same interest groups, the same neoconservative ideology. Certainly, if Hillary gets in there, it'll simply worsen because she has declared that the president of Russia is the new Hitler. Well, how do you describe a worse enemy, you see? Trump, he says, well, he's willing to talk with Putin and work things out and doesn't think conflict is good. But who really controls the government? It's not the president. The policies are in place, bureaucracies are in place, the neoconservative ideology is in place. It dominates the American media, both print and television, the think tanks, the foreign policy associations. So it would be very difficult for Trump to alter this equation. He would have to have a very knowledgeable and dedicated and determined team who were willing to displace all of the neoconservatives and all of their supportive media. So that in itself would be a war. So I would have to say that Eric, is a far greater concern than the next financial crisis, which has to happen.
Let's talk about the next financial crisis, Dr. Roberts. There are some serious players, obviously, in the world that are beginning to warn that we have a 2008 scenario or worse in front of us. What do you see coming?
Well, it's the same scenario. The other one was never dealt with. It was just papered over with more debt. The Fed issued an amazing amount of money in order to protect the solvency of the big banks. They had to buy up half the balance sheets of debt instruments that were no good and put them on the Fed's books by creating money. So nothing's changed. It's just that the crisis was papered over with money and debt creation. And the same factors that produced that 2008 crisis are still there. They're still continuing. And so the question is, when does it manifest again? What sets it off? And why won't the Fed simply do the same thing? Just create more money and buy up the bad instruments and keep the situation from ever being fixed. People of my day in government, they never thought that the function of a central bank was to support fraud and massive financial manipulation and all the things that happen. Yet that's what the central bank now does. So as long as it's willing to do that, one assumes that they can. And I have always expected, as you know, we've talked about this many times, that the consequences of the Fed's policy would impact the dollar, and that when the dollar started failing, this would prevent the Fed from continuing the bailouts. But they appear to have the dollar rigged too, because where do you go? We've talked about this. Why would you go to the euro when you see the European Central Bank doing quantitative easing? In fact, they recently increased the quantitative easing. Why would you go to the Japanese yen when the Japanese Central Bank is doing quantitative easing? In other words, the other two large currencies are being printed, created as rapidly as the Fed created dollars. So why leave the dollar? There's no place to go. And we've talked about gold and silver. We see that the Fed also protects the dollar from the rise in the gold price by having the bullion banks dump massive amounts of naked shorts in the COMEX at no trading times when there's little or no trading. And this drives down the contract price and sets off stop-loss orders and margin calls, and the margin banks who produce this crisis make money out of it, but it suppresses the gold price. So as long as they can keep the Fed policy of massive bailouts from impacting the dollar, they can continue that policy. Or so it seems to me.
Dr. Roberts, let's talk a bit more about gold, because as you said, there is the suppression that goes on there. It's very unnatural, but we've seen the gold market turn even in the face of that and have a rise towards the $1,300 level. Obviously, we've had this pullback, but it appears to have, inside of its secular bull market, entered that next leg higher, and that's despite the West trying to hold it down. How will that end? I mean, talk to the global audience about your vision of that, because you have that experience with the U.S. Treasury, and when you're unnaturally suppressing the price of something, it's like a coiled spring, isn't it? It explodes.
Well, when I was in Treasury, the government had more integrity. It didn't manipulate things like this. It would have been a violation of law. In fact, I think it is right now a violation of law, but they never let us do it. in the futures market where the price of gold is determined. It's rigged. So if the Federal Reserve wants the bullion banks to dump naked contracts, they'll dump them. And the price of those contracts, when you dump in a whole bunch of uncovered shorts, you are increasing the supply of gold in those markets. Not real gold, but paper gold, because the price of gold is determined by the paper contract. And so if you increase the supply of these contracts, you've increased the gold supply in that market. And so it drives down the price. And so when people buy and sell the actual metal itself, it's not their trading that determines the price. It's the trading of the contracts in the paper market that determines the price. So this whole time, all these years, since when was it? It started in the fall of 2011, the suppression of gold by these naked shorts. During this whole time, the demand for gold has risen. The supply of gold has been restrained. We have had periods during the suppression of gold and silver prices when both the Canadian Mint and the U.S. Mint selling the coins, especially the silver ones, had to suspend sales because they couldn't keep up with the demand, and yet the price was falling. Well, anytime you have constrained supply and rising demand, price has to rise unless it's being manipulated. So they have successfully manipulated the price since the fall of 2011 using naked shorts. Of course, many of the people who followed the gold market for years are convinced they've always manipulated it, that they actually that the Federal Reserve was actually leasing out the gold it had to bullion dealers who were dumping it in the market, adding real increases in gold to suppress the price. And that as the stocks drew down, they moved into using these uncovered shorts. So when does that stop, Eric? I suppose what would stop it would be if the bullion banks or the London market, whoever, the futures markets, if they can't make deliveries to the Asians, if when the Chinese and Indians place large orders for bullion and the West can't deliver the bullion because the stocks are exhausted and they've all moved to Asia, that's when the Fed can't manipulate the gold and silver price any longer. So I don't know if we're close to that or not. No one knows what the stocks are. We're told that there's 8,000 tons of gold in Fort Knox. 8,000 tons of gold. I mean, that's the figure they use in Fort Knox, and yet no one can get an audit. This was one of the things that Congressman Ron Paul tried for years, just to get an audit. Can we have somebody go there and see? And they won't let you have an audit. So how come you can have the gold but not let anybody see it? And then we had that curious episode we talked about at the time. It was a couple of years ago, I think, when the Germans asked for their gold back, which was being kept for them by the Federal Reserve. And the Germans were told they couldn't have it. Remember, I think they had 1,500 tons, 1,500 tons of gold that was being kept in safety in the United States, and they asked for it to be returned. And I think we agreed to give them 300 tons of it over 7 years. And the first year we gave them 5 tons. So, and Germany is an important ally. How come they couldn't give Germany the gold if they have the gold? So there's so many things that never get any answer. that don't make any sense. It sort of implies that maybe the stocks are drawn down and that the ability of the Fed to continue to manipulate the price is disappearing because they are looking ahead to the time when the demand for gold from India and China can't be satisfied. These people go into the markets and place large orders, and there's no gold to sell them. So that's the other constraint. So to sum up, what is the constraint on the Fed's debt and money creation? And I think it remains the dollar. As long as they can keep the dollar protected, they can keep their policy, which is totally destructive of the American economy, totally destructive of households, the elderly. They get no income from their savings. They have to draw down their savings, so there's nothing for the heirs. The insurance companies must be hurting. There's no interest income to balance their equity and other portfolios with. This has to hurt the insurance companies. The pension funds must be suffering. There's no interest on Treasury bonds. So this policy hurts everybody but the few mega banks. So you have the complete sacrifice of the economic interest of the entire country to 4 or 5 banks. And this has been going on now since 2008. This is 2016. That's 8 years ago. And they've gotten away with sacrificing everybody's interests to the interests of 4 or 5 big banks. And there's no outcry. Congress is not investigating. The economists don't say anything about it. People just apparently accept it. So I assume that will continue as long as they can make it continue. And the other constraint is, of course, how much gold still exists that can be delivered to purchasers. And if the orders that come in from Asia and China are just too large to be met, then the fake rigged price in the COMEX market falls apart. And the Fed loses control of the gold price and the silver price. So those are the two constraints. And they're still there. They're still operating. And they're exposed. It's not like we haven't told people about this, but nothing happens.
There was a comment recently, we'll go the other direction with this, by one of the individuals at PIMCO, that the suggestion that was made was to go ahead and raise the price to, say, $5,000 gold. And that would be a way to, rather than additional QE, create the inflation that they're looking for. And, of course, the West desperately needs to get out of the debt that it's experiencing. And so I think that's where PIMCO was coming from. The individual there with that suggestion is that would be a way to inflate out some of this debt from the West.
It's entirely possible that if the Fed was not manipulating or permitting or enabling the manipulation of the bullion prices, and if people realize the dire straits of the situation, they realize that the Fed has created something like $4 trillion during a period in which the U.S. real GDP did not grow commensurately, such that the dollar essentially is devalued. Then more people would want gold if they understood that and its implications. And if the price wasn't set on by the bullion banks issuing naked shorts, then the gold price could explode. It could go 5,000. It could go beyond it. Who knows? But you can't find out when it's controlled.
In closing, Dr. Roberts, when you look around the world at what the West is engaged in, obviously the power is flowing to the East, and so there are these threats of war. But if the world can get through this without war, what do you envision for the West?
I think the West no longer exists. There's no longer any democracy in the West. Certainly not in the United States. Look, the people have chosen Trump, and so what are the politicians doing? They won't accept the choice. They simply won't accept the choice. We see the same thing all over Europe. We see where the British military announced that if the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, were to win the election, they simply would not let him take office. So, again, there's no willingness to accept the decision of people, of democratic outcomes are set aside. And we saw it in what happened to Greece. It didn't matter how the people voted. They had no input. They were forced into poverty through all kinds of austerity that only serves a few banks. So if you look also at the EU, the countries in the EU, the people never got to vote on that. They were just put there, despite the opposition by governments. And now it's come out that, in fact, it was exposed 16 years ago that the EU is a creation of the CIA. I wrote about it today. It's on my website this morning. The CIA wanted a single country, a united Europe, because it's easier to control one country than to control a whole bunch of separate governments. And they've been working on this since 1950. All kinds of documents were declassified that prove this completely. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's the documents that are released, declassified. They've been out 16 years. So you've got the United States, in order to exercise hegemony, has created the European Union, in which all the nations disappear. There's no longer to be a Britain or a French people or a German people or Italian people or Spanish people or Dutch people. They're all just gone. They're now called Europeans. Their parliaments are powerless because of laws made by an uncountable European Commission. So there's no West. It's gone. It can't be brought back. It's not here. And so where do you see things rising? Well, China, Russia, but they've got their own problems, you know. Russia lets foreigners own 20% of its media. So you've got 20% of the Russian media foreign-owned, that means U.S.-owned, CIA-owned, working full-time to destabilize Russia. And the Russian government sits there and allows this. In China, it just came out that there are 7,000 Western-funded non-governmental organizations operating in China, working full-time to destabilize the country. And finally, just this week, the Chinese finally said, oh, well, we better have the police watch these people and see what they do. As if that's any kind of restraint. Now, Washington's got plenty of money for the NGOs to bribe the police. So these two countries are sitting ducks for destabilization. They haven't got enough sense to stop the treason in their midst. They'll both be destabilized. Look what's happening to the BRICS. The two weaker components of the five countries, South Africa and Brazil, are under full-scale assault by Washington. We have created political scandals in both countries. The Reformist Party in Brazil that tried to represent, at least to some extent, the Brazilian people, instead of the 1% and Washington, they're all to be put on trial. The president is under investigation. She may be arrested. There's a recall procedure underway. The same in South Africa. Political scandals. The governments that tried to represent the people are under full-scale assault from Washington. So there's 2/5 of the BRICS being knocked out of action. This leaves China, Russia, and India. And I've already said, the Russian government, for some strange reason, allows the CIA to run 20% of its news service. And China allows 7,000 NGOs to work full-time to destabilize the country. They're everywhere. They're in the universities. They're in the government. So what chance do they have? I just see it's a total mess. There's no prospect anywhere. And look at the total inability of the West to produce leadership. And everywhere we see the continuing destruction of the environment for the sake of short-term capitalist profit. Everywhere. Things everywhere. The natural environment is under full-scale assault. So where's the leadership? There's not any. Where is it in the media? There's not any. The Western media is a propaganda organization. It lies for the corporations. It lies for the government. That's all it does. People can't even get information. Look, we're told that we've had a recovery going on since June of 2009. And yet during this whole time, the real median family income is falling. The labor force participation rate is falling. Consumers are so indebted they can't take on more debt. There's nothing to support any growth in aggregate demand. The profits are made from offshoring jobs, from using investment depreciation allowances for bonuses of management. The whole thing is rotten to the core. So I don't see any hopeful signs. And a forest fire is raging all over the world, and it's just not noticed. Nobody pays any attention. It's just the world's burning up, and oh well, how nice everything is. Look, we have a recovery. The government's own unemployment measure, which includes short-term discouraged, is 10%. So the 5% rate is a rate that does not measure unemployment. No discouraged workers are in that number. So it's a completely rigged number, but the financial press doesn't say that. They present this like, oh, look how wonderful we are. We only have 5% unemployment. The government's own official measure says it's 10. And if you count the long-term discouraged workers like John Williams does at shadowstats.com, which the United States used to count, it's 23%. So we got a recovery with 23% unemployment. And these lies stand, and nobody pays any attention.
Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and former Associate Editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal.